shall come in like a flood. The Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against him. The truth of God will be brought into evidence when Satan's control over the entire world has gained such proportion. Then it is time for God to make an intervention and lift up a standard against him. Now, you can recognize right away that standard that is to be raised up, of course, is the cross of Calvary and all that is associated with it. Now, in the instances of wrath in the Bible record, and there are a number of them that stand out very distinctively, the flood is one of them. Uzzah touching the ark, Kor, Dathan, and Abiram, the destruction of Nadab and Abihu, these instances of destruction and wrath, as evidence in the Scripture, should be looked at with very, very close analysis, or the person may derive a conclusion that God, in a very definite way, is accountable for the destruction of those persons. Now, this is true, because we know that God is sovereign of the earth, and nothing occurs, as we have already studied, nothing occurs without his permission. And it is the cross of Calvary, where Christ died for the sins of the entire world, even those before the flood, that gives him the right to intervene in the case of the lives of the wicked in behalf of the consequence of their evil deeds. So one must never forget that every instance of wrath and destruction in the earth must be considered and interpreted in the light of Calvary and the experience of Christ on the cross. Now, there are certain things that a person should look for in dealing with the interpretation of wrath in the Bible, and one that is very, very distinctive. A person must understand Satan's position in these great aspects of destruction. In the same way, we must consider where Satan is in relationship to Christ on Calvary, and we'll be taking that up in the lesson or so. So, as we go through this particular study, one wants to know and to watch where Satan is and what control he has in regards to such an event as the destruction on such a cataclysmic basis as is the case of the destruction of the whole earth by water. So let's turn to the book of Isaiah again in the 17th chapter and the 13th verse. It says, "The nations shall rush like the rushing of many waters, but God shall rebuke them, and they shall flee far off, and shall be chased as the chaff of the mountains before the wind, like a rolling thing before the whirlwind. And behold, at eventide trouble, and before the morning he is not. This is the portion of them that spoil us, and the lot of them that rob us." Now here these prophets speaks of the wicked as rushing many waters, but God shall rebuke them. Now the point that a person wants to see here, and in all of these verses and dealing with this subject of wrath, as I have spoken of from time to time, we must clearly determine the forces of good and the forces of evil and how they are characterized in the instances that we consider in interpreting the wrath of God. Now notice in this text, "The nations shall rush like the rushing of many waters, but God shall rebuke them." In other words, God takes up a position in opposition to the rushing of many waters. Because the waters here are representing the wicked, and when we're speaking of them in the waters in the sense of covering the entire world, then we're speaking of iniquity gaining such tremendous proportions as to engulf practically the entire world. And God is going to take up a position in opposition to them. And they shall be, as he says here, the chaff chased before the wind. Now, in the book of Genesis, the 6th chapter, we want to start now picking up the biblical revelation of the conditions of the flood and point out certain aspects and how it developed so that the person knows explicitly where God is in this great catastrophe and where Satan is in the same event. I am calling your attention to the book of Genesis, the 6th chapter, verse 11 and 12. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. The earth was filled with violence. Now, then it's very, very obvious that the people themselves were corrupt, and they were filled in violence, very likely between each other. And verse 12, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Now, when you read that in English, a person does not get the real revelation of that verse. And so I want to point out certain characteristics that will develop consistent with the entire Bible interpretation of wrath and from whence it comes and what it is purporting to accomplish. Now, this verse says, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. Now, we know from the verses we have read concerning the symbol of water that that corruption must have been extensive as to engulf practically the whole populace of the earth, with probably the exception of those people who are in the ark. And it says they had corrupted his way upon the earth. That is, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Now, the word for corrupt that's used twice in this verse is the word shakaf in Hebrew, which is the word for Satan in the Bible. And now, that is interesting, and while I'm in Genesis, I'd like to point out your attention to, or Exodus, another situation that gains tremendous proportions and is very symbolic and meaningful in the Scripture, and this is the destruction of the firstborn in Egypt. And you understand now, as I said before, Egypt in Hebrew is the word for Satan. So now we're dealing with a similar situation, that the people who corrupted themselves had given themselves completely over to Satan, and the situation of God bringing them out of Egypt has a very close parallel. And I want to read Exodus 12:23. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. Now, you recall in a previous study, I pointed out to you that in many of the instances of destruction and wrath, the Bible will plainly declare that God does it in order to establish God's sovereignty and the great first cause in dealing with evil, because he has suffered the entire world in the expression of wrath on Calvary. He has suffered the sins and the wrath of the entire world. And that gives him the right to intervene and reveal his love in dealing with sinners. Now, notice that this text is like many that I have previously read and pointed out to you, that God is being established as sovereign, and that his law of sin and death, as well as the law of righteousness and love and kindness, is operative in every situation, and God is sovereign in every case. And so it starts out by saying, the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. Now, that's as clear as the English language can put it, that God does the smiting. Now, watch it develop and switch from the first person of God as the source of destruction to the sources of wickedness. And when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and on the two side posts, the Lord will pass over the door. Now, some people, when they read this, have the picture that as Christ and the angels were going through Egypt and they saw the blood on the door, then they would just pass over that door and go on to the next house and check to see if it had the blood. Now, that is not the meaning of this text. When it says, and Christ will pass over the door, the word pass over here is the same word for the bolt or the deadlock on a door that passes from the door into the casing to lock the door. And so this text means that God throws himself over the door, stretching out his arms, and the purpose of doing this is now picked up in this verse. Now let me read that again, and as I read that, pass over the door, you think of Christ and the angels throwing themselves over the door so that certain persons cannot enter in. So it says, when they saw the blood on the two side posts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not suffer the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. Now here it has switched from the Lord smiting to the destroyer smiting. Now the reason I read this text is that the word for the destroyer, and when the article is put with it, it is designating in the language of the Hebrew a very specific person. And obviously it refers to Satan. And once a person understands the word destroyer in Hebrew, shakath is the same word used in Genesis 6:12, where it says, God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. It was shakath. It was characterized by Satan. So in this text, it starts off by saying that God would smite, and then he said he threw himself over the door to prevent the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. Now, there the picture is absolutely correct. God is taking the credit for the smiting because he has suffered all the destruction and all the evil that Satan has brought upon the people of God and the Egyptians. And to show that, it starts off by saying that God will pass through to smite the land. Then he will switch to the actual agent of destruction, which is in this case Satan, and that is also true of the flood, as we shall see. So the picture in Genesis 2, verse 11 and 12 indicate very clearly that Satan has entire control of the people of the antediluvians. Now, the spirit of prophecy has equally a critical look and a verification of the facts of the Bible. And in the Bible Commentary, Volume 1, page 1090, it says, the indulgence of appetite and base passion were made their imaginations altogether corrupt. Now, it's very, very clear the one who was behind their practice of base passions and indulgence of appetite was Satan. The antediluvians, continuing in the quotation, the antediluvians were the slaves of Satan, led and controlled by him. So once the conclusion is indicative in the Bible and the spirit of prophecy that Satan has entire control of the antediluvians, then that which comes to them will come to them from his hand. Now, there is a tremendous statement in Desire of Ages 37. It says this, with intense interest, the unfallen worlds watched to see Jehovah arise and sweep away the inhabitants of the earth. Now, the context of this statement is concerning the early part of the history of the world as it achieved to a very distinctive corruption. And it says here that unfallen worlds watched to see Jehovah arise and sweep away and destroy the earth. Now, I'm continuing with the quote, and if God should do this, Satan was ready to carry out his plan for securing to himself the allegiance of heavenly beings. Now, that statement indicates that if God would arise and sweep away the inhabitants of earth because of their corruption, Satan would make a point of that and use it to captivate a legions of unfallen creatures that were still in heaven. Now, continuing the quotation, he had declared that the principles of God's government make forgiveness impossible. Had the world been destroyed, he would have claimed that his accusations were proved true. That is to say, that if God did arise on some occasion and destroy the sinful world, Satan would use that as an accusation against God, proving his declarations were true, that the people could not keep the law, and that God does not have a compassionate feeling towards transgressors. But the statement continues to read, he was ready to cast blame upon God and to spread his rebellion to the worlds above. But instead of destroying the world, God sent his Son to save it. Now, the attitude of God in destroying the world is negative. God would send his Son to save it. So the ark is a symbol of Christ, and those who come into the life of Christ as their personal Savior will save themselves from the destruction that Satan purports to accomplish. Now, continuing with this subject of the flood, turn in the Bible to Isaiah 54. And Sister White says we should study this chapter distinctively. And I think I can see why as we look at some of these verses. In Isaiah 54, I'm looking at verse 5. For thy Maker is thine husband. Now here it states in the aspect of social relationships of man and wife, in the very close relationship that this particular institution affords, God uses it to reveal the relationship of himself with sinners. I am married to you. And then he goes on that says, and God, the God of the whole earth, shall he be called. For the Lord hath called thee as a woman forsaken and grieved in spirit, and a wife of youth, when thou wast refused, saith the Lord. For a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. Now, this forsaking is a situation when God permits the evil consequence of in the lives of the saints, or in the case of the people at the time of the flood, to come upon them, and he is going to make some provision for their salvation, which of course was the ark. So it says, for a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. Now this also has relationship to Christ on Calvary, which every experience in the Bible record of wrath is always centered in Calvary. As I've said, the greatest argument to interpret the subject of wrath in the Bible is interpreted from the light of Calvary. So it says, as it says here, that in a moment God forsakes the persons, yet with great mercies he will gather them. Now you see, this is the same experience of Christ on Calvary when he cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have thou forsaken me? But with great mercies he gathered him from the grave and to a position of honor throughout the universe. Now notice what it goes on to say, for a small moment have I forsaken thee. Now this is very important, and we'll have a complete study upon God turning his face. And here's a case of it, but I just point this out to you. For a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. In a little wrath I hid my face from thee for a moment, but with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee, saith thy Redeemer. Now you see, verse 8 emphasized and enlarged the verse 7. It said that God for a moment turned away, but he will gather them with great mercies and kindnesses. In a little wrath I hid my face from thee for a moment, but with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee, saith the Lord. For this is as the waters of Noah unto me. Now what he has said in verse 7 and 8, that he will turn his face, and in little wrath they will be destroyed, but with great mercies they shall be gathered. Now he says, this is as the waters of Noah unto me. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so have I sworn that I would not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. Now you see, the waters over the earth was a great destruction of wrath and anger and hate. So as the waters in their great turmoil rushed upon the people and brought their destruction, and great stones were thrown into the air by the pressure of the water on the earth, this great catastrophe of water, which is symbolic of people, is indicative that they are destroying each other, which is the case because Satan has corrupted them and has full control, and they, in great many cases, turn upon each other, of which the water is symbolic. But now notice that this statement says, for this is as the waters of Noah. That is, God in his control turned his face away and permitted the wrath that he had suffered in regards to the people before the flood to have control of them, and it destroyed them. And the one who is the source of wrath, which is the source of sin, which is Satan, had entire control of them. So what takes place in their lives would surely come as a result of Satan's jurisdiction over them. Now, when you read patriarchs and prophets on the flood, it explicitly states that Satan had control of the people before the flood, and of course what came upon them was a result of his institution. So it says the waters of Noah is indicative that God has turned his face and permitted wrath to come. So the wrath did not come from God. it came from Satan. I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth. In other words, that there should not be such a destruction again. So have I sworn that I would not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. So the waters covering the earth and destroying the people in a great exhibition of wrath and hatred and destruction, here it is declared that God was not wroth with them. Now, it would be very, very inconsistent with the Bible to interpret this verse to mean that God was wroth with the people and destroyed them at the flood, and then said, I'll not do it again. I won't do it anymore. No, God is the same yesterday and forever, and he does not change. So a person must interpret this flood in its symbolic meaning as well as its real meaning, as indicative of God turning his face and permitting Satan, as even in the case of the destruction of the firstborn in Egypt, Satan was the one, because in the Hebrew words it's indicative that Satan has entire control. In the book of Psalms, the 18th chapter, there is a verse interpreting the waters. It says in Psalms 18:4, the sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. So you see there, he indicates that the waters represent the wicked people of whom Satan has complete control. Now, notice in the book of Ezekiel, the 22nd chapter, a statement in verse 26. Ezekiel 22:26. And it reads in this manner, her priest, speaking of Israel, have violated my law, and have profaned mine holy things. They have put no difference between the holy and the profane, neither have they showed difference between the unclean and the clean, and have hid their eyes from my Sabbath, and I am profaned. This indicates that they have violated the law of God, and this is the same word used in Genesis 6, where I read concerning the conditions before the flood. It says that they are in great violation of God's law. In verse 11 of the 6th chapter of Genesis, for the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So the violence, of course, has one source, and that source is the great instigator of all evil and iniquity, and that is Satan. Now, I'll call your attention to this verse in Ezekiel 22:26 again. Her priests have violated my law. Now, the word for violate in this text, Hamas, is also the word for wrath in Hebrew. So the priests have violated, they have shown wrath and hatred, and the same violence before the earth is the wrath. So we may say that the people were violent, they were exhibiting wrath, and that wrath brought their destruction. Now, look at Deuteronomy, the 31st chapter, and verse 17, and here the prophet points out a very significant point, which we've also already brought up in the subject of the destruction by the flood. But notice now how the Bible, in its unique and clear revelation of truth, points out the factors that interpret the great exhibitions of wrath as the flood would indicate. This is Deuteronomy 31. I'm reading verse 17 and 18. Then my anger shall be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them. And I will hide myself from them, and they shall be devoured, and many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in that day, are not these evils come upon us, because our God is not among us? Now that is what is said in this verse is exactly what was said concerning the flood, that Satan had control, and God had turned his face away, and for a short time had forsaken them, but in great mercies he will gather them. So this text indicates this. It says that then my anger shall be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them. And the people will say in that day, are not these evils come upon us, because the Our God is not among us. Now, that is true, and it is not true, and a person must be discriminating, or he will have the wrong idea of wrath. That my anger shall be kindled against them in that day. Now, why does God say his anger shall be kindled against them in that day? Is because he has suffered it for them. But if they continue in evil, then it says he will forsake them, as he did Christ on the cross, and permit the wrath which he has suffered for them to come upon them. And that's exactly what the latter part of the text says, that these evils are come upon us because our God is not among us. And in every exhibition of wrath and evil in the lives of persons on this earth, it is because God's suffering the wrath for them on the cross has been withheld from them, or as God has turned his face from them, and they then reap the consequence of their own conduct. Now, verse 18 says, in Deuteronomy 31, it says, "And I will surely hide my face in that day for all the evils which they have wrought, in that they are turned unto other gods." Now, that tells you why God turns his face, is because they have turned their face from God to their gods, which are a violation of his law, and as a consequence, sin has destroyed them. So you can see by these statements that God has not been a participant in the wrath and destruction of the earth. He has suffered it, and through his Son offers a means of an ark that we may escape through Christ, our Redeemer. In the Great Controversy, page 36, it says, "God does not stand toward the sinner as an executioner of the sentence against transgression, but he leaves the rejectors of his mercy to themselves to reap that which they have sown." Certainly, this is applicable to the flood.